from the historic campus of Hillsdale College in Hillsdale, Michigan, where the good, the true, and the beautiful are taught, nurtured, and honored. This is the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour, bringing the activity and education of the college to listeners across the country.
National popular vote does not really consider and just chooses to ignore the fact that there are different ways of doing elections in different states. Most of them are, sort of minor. They have different recount rules, for example, or different ways, that voters are allowed to early vote.
This is your host, Scot Bertram. Welcome to the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour, part of the Hillsdale College Podcast Network. That was Trent England, founder and executive director of Save Our States. We'll talk with Trent in depth later on about conflicts emerging between ranked choice voting and the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact, two ideas about changing elections finding traction on the left. First, we're joined by Dr. Joseph Postell, Associate Professor of Politics here at Hillsdale College. Dr. Postell, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me on the show.
We talked a couple of weeks ago about the history of and the development of political conventions. Since then, this 2024 race has gotten a little more interesting, and the Democratic National Convention also had the potential to be extremely interesting, though at this point, Kamala Harris has secured the Democratic nomination via a virtual vote with delegates a couple of weeks ago. So the 2024 Democratic National Convention might not appear on a future edition of this list. So if we go back through some of the most important consequential conventions through the years, I think we start in 1860, probably, where we have a split on the Democratic side and we have Lincoln on the Republican side. This is one year when both parties have very consequential conventions.
Yeah, that's right. So you mentioned Chicago when you sort of introduced the subject here today, and it's interesting that Chicago will be a recurring theme in the history of major nomination conventions. And 1860 features one party holding its convention in Chicago. That's the Republican Party. And they're a sort of dark horse candidate named Abraham Lincoln, if you've heard of him. Comes from out of nowhere. William Seward is the sort of odds-on favorite to win the nomination at the convention. And there's a lot of horse trading that goes on in these conventions in the 19th century, as we discussed the last time we talked. And so Lincoln manages to sort of take the nomination from Seward and obviously goes on to win the presidency due to really the chaos in the Democratic Party. And the interesting thing here is that the Republican Party has just been born, really. It's less than 10 years old, probably less than 5 years old, depending on when you place the birth date of the Republican Party. But most people think that it is born essentially out of the Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854. And so you really have a party that's barely 5, not even 10 years old, that has really come out of a tumultuous period where the Whig Party has died and the Republican Party has been born out of a kind of anti-slavery core. There's a lot of other elements to the party, but it's really driven by the question of what to do about slavery. And the Democratic Party has not yet had its reckoning on that question. So the Democratic Party has survived because of the notion of popular sovereignty in the North. This is obviously Stephen Douglas's famous defense of the Kansas-Nebraska Act as saying, we can be neutral on the question of slavery. We just let every state decide what it wants to do about that. The problem is there's been this Supreme Court decision called Dred Scott, where the Supreme Court has indicated that even though Dred Scott had to do with a territory and not a state, that if you have property rights in a slave, then you can take the slave wherever you want. And that would imply that Dred Scott has basically nationalized slavery, has made it legal everywhere. And Lincoln says you're going to have a second Dred Scott opinion, which is going to extend slavery now into the free states. And so the Democratic Party can no longer maintain this neutrality that Stephen Douglas has tried to stake. And so you have basically the Northern and the Southern Democratic wings of the party fighting it out in two separate conventions in 1860. And finally, the party eventually just splits, and there's basically a Southern party that nominates its own candidate, and then a Northern party that nominates Stephen Douglas, actually, to run. It's the sort of the rematch of the Lincoln-Douglas campaign from the Illinois Senate race in 1858. And so Lincoln loses the Senate race in 1858, but he wins the presidency in 1860. So these are two enormously consequential conventions that really lead to the breakdown of the parties, of course, and to the rise of the Civil War.
If we move forward around 50 years or so, the 1912 Republican Convention, this time the Republicans have a bit of a split on their hands.
Yeah, that's a good way to connect these two. The 1912 conventions, and I really consider three of them to be the critical conventions in 1912. I think these are the most important conventions in American history. Maybe, as we'll get to in a little bit, the 1968 convention for the Democratic Party was just as consequential. But here you have a fight now between the Republican Party and between the progressive and conservative wings of the Republican Party. Theodore Roosevelt, who people don't often think of as a progressive, has really come back from a sort of semi-retirement to challenge his own sort of named successor, right? He named Taft as his successor.
It's so silly. I've never thought of this, but perhaps a paper in the future on the similarities between Teddy Roosevelt and Jay Leno.
You have to elaborate on this.
Leno, of course, abdicates from his throne as the Tonight Show host and then decides about a year later, you know what? I think I'd like to have that back. I'm going to come take that back.
I see. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and he even says, "Oh, it wasn't a permanent retirement. Yeah. It was just, I was just saying I didn't want a third cup of coffee just yet." Sort of thing. So he decides to come back. He's really disappointed in Taft because he thought Taft would be a progressive. Taft thought he was a progressive in a way, he wasn't the kind of progressive that Theodore Roosevelt was. Theodore Roosevelt was the kind of progressive who wanted to disrupt everything, tear down the entire constitutional system and replace it with a kind of presidential system. And so he comes back to challenge Taft. And really the question in 1912, which sets the stage for the next century or more in American politics, is do we nominate our candidates through the so-called superdelegates or, the unpledged delegates, the party insiders, or do we do it through primaries in which the candidates go straight to the people to get the nomination? And so Roosevelt and Taft have it out in a bunch of primaries. Of course, Roosevelt wins all the primaries. If you're a voter in 1912, which of these two candidates do you like more?
Right.
I mean, there is no candidate potentially in all of American history who's more charismatic and magnetic than Theodore Roosevelt. So he wins all the primaries, but the problem is he's completely opposed to everything his party stands for. So what do you do with this person who's very popular with the voters in your party, but who seems to be against everything that your party stands for? And this is the question the Republicans face in 1912 at their convention. Do we basically just go with the guy who won the primaries, or the person who stands for what we believe is right? And they say, we're picking the latter. We're taking Taft. They basically deny Roosevelt the nomination at the convention. They say, we are the party. We get to decide what we stand for. You do not get to take over our party from outside. And so there's interesting parallels here, obviously, to later conventions and later campaigns. And so Roosevelt says, okay, fine, you've made your bed, but I'm very popular. And so I'm just going to run my own party, which we call the Bull Moose Party today, which is a great indication of how it's not really a party. It's just the Roosevelt Party. It's technically called the Progressive Party. And so when Roosevelt gets to the Progressive Party convention, Republican convention is in Chicago. The Progressive Party convention is also in Chicago. He gives his own speech. There's a famous line that he ends the speech: "We stand at Armageddon and we battle for the Lord." And the crowd just goes absolutely nuts. At one point, there's like a 50-minute standing ovation given to Theodore Roosevelt. It's really a religious revival, not a deliberative convention. And so those two conventions are happening at the same time in Chicago, and the Republican Party is going to be split apart by this. But it's also going to mean that the Republican Party will not be the Progressive Party because they've taken the progressives out of their own party. On the other side, you have this guy, Woodrow Wilson, who's a kind of stealth candidate who ends up sort of seizing the nomination on something like the 37th ballot in Baltimore. And he's actually sort of redirecting the Democratic Party towards a progressive orientation. And he's doing it in a very sneaky way. So Wilson's nomination in 1912 is a harbinger of what's to come for the Democratic Party in the future, whereas the Republican Party has really put itself on a more conservative path in 1912.
Talking with Dr. Joseph Postell, Associate Professor of Politics here at Hillsdale College, about some of the most important and consequential conventions, political conventions through our nation's history. 20 years into the future, 1932, the Democrats end up nominating a president, a soon-to-be president, who would shape the party, shape the nation for the next 15 years or so.
Yes, so the 32 Democratic Convention is obviously the one that nominates Franklin Roosevelt and leads to Roosevelt's New Deal and also, of course, his 4 terms, almost 4 complete terms as president. Mm-hmm. This is obviously a momentous decision for the Democratic Party to go with FDR. It's a very interesting campaign, and it's a very interesting convention because if you read the Democratic Party's platform in 1932, it is far more conservative than the Republican Party's platform in 32. And Herbert Hoover, who obviously is the Republican incumbent candidate in 32 who loses to FDR, he actually is a progressive. He has a very high position in Woodrow Wilson's administration, and he's sort of derisively called Wonder Boy by Calvin Coolidge for being, sort of the party's progressive. Coolidge obviously was a conservative Republican. Mm-hmm. And so the party didn't really love Herbert Hoover. He was more of a progressive side of the Republican Party at that time. And so the Democratic campaign in 1932 was essentially to attack Herbert Hoover from the right, to say that Herbert Hoover had created too much government spending, mm-hmm. too much bureaucracy, and that the Democratic Party will somehow correct that if it's elected in 1932, which of course proved to be the exact opposite, right? They doubled down or tripled down or quadrupled down on those policies once FDR was elected. And so there's this really interesting thing happening in the Democratic Party in 32. They have to decide between the conservative path and the progressive path. Mm-hmm. What they actually decide is the conservative path, but they choose FDR. And FDR really in some ways betrays the party by sort of presenting himself as somebody consistent with the conservative platform, but then essentially governing entirely antithetical to what the party stood for. And there's a fellow named Al Smith. There's still a dinner, I think, every year in D.C. Yep. He was the first Catholic nominated by any of the major parties. And he was the nominee in 1928 for the Democratic Party. And he was very conservative. And the Democratic Party was a very conservative party up until FDR. I mean, Thomas Jefferson and Andrew Jackson were the founders of the Democratic Party. And Al Smith in 1936 gives this great speech called The Facts in the Case. You can find it anywhere on the internet, I think. And he just says, look, I nominated a candidate who would abide by the platform that we had in 1932. And what FDR has done is he's betrayed us all. And now we have to decide whether we want to betray him and go to the other party or not. And Al Smith actually campaigns on behalf of Alf Landon in 1936 against FDR. And so 32 is a really important convention for the Democratic Party, probably the most important for putting them on the more progressive path. And so that's really a critical turning point for them.
In 1948 at the Democratic Convention, there's some echoes of 1860, which we talked about previously, and this split in the Democratic Party.
Yeah, that's right. And it really does give rise to, I think, it's not entirely accurate, but one of the last third-party campaigns for presidency that actually is successful at winning several states. This is the Dixiecrats in 1948. So what happens, of course, in 48 is the Democratic Party is once again at a crossroads, right? It has to decide what it's going to do with the Southern element in its own party. Historically, of course, the Democratic Party was always the Southern party. It was the party of the secession in the Civil War. It was the party of states' rights. It was the party of limited national government. And that's its tradition for a century. But after the New Deal, of course, the question for the Democratic Party is, how much are we going to emphasize, say, civil rights as a national intervention in state domestic issues? And so the nomination of Harry Truman is a clear sign that the Democratic Party is going to become a pro-civil rights party. It's going to become more favorable to national law legislation that's going to intervene in the southern states on this question. And of course, this is essentially the Democratic Party in a way attacking its own core of support. So the Southerners pick up on this very quickly. There's one point Harry Truman speaks over the radio at a Democratic gathering in Arkansas. And I think a large portion, maybe even over half of the people, get up and walk out of the room as their own presidential candidate is speaking directly to them. So this highlights the tension in the party. And essentially you see in 1948 the beginnings of what's going to transpire in the South, which is that the South will no longer be the core base of the Democratic Party, and the Democratic Party is going to pivot on the question of civil rights towards a more nationalist point of view.
Talking with Dr. Joseph Postell, Associate Professor of Politics here at Hillsdale College, about memorable, consequential, important political conventions. Started in Chicago, made our way through Chicago. We're in Chicago this year for the DNC. We're in Chicago in 1968, and perhaps we've been sort of building to this, which might be, at least of the modern conventions, the most well-known, the most memorable, in part because TV images play such a massive part in what people see unfold both inside the convention and outside on the streets of Chicago.
Yeah, so this is 1968. The Democratic convention in Chicago is occurring, of course, with a Democratic incumbent president, Lyndon Johnson, who has since dropped out. He starts to run for re-election. He takes a relatively serious challenge in New Hampshire from a fellow named Eugene McCarthy. And he says, I don't really have the support of my own party the way that I need. It's obviously going to be a problem for me in the general election. And so Lyndon Johnson sort of says he refuses to run for re-election in 68. This then leaves you with an open Democratic primary right in the middle of the Vietnam War. The student protest movement is starting to pick up. Racial tensions in urban areas in 1968 is a major story. You have the assassination of one of the main candidates, Robert F. Kennedy, on the night that he wins the California primary, which is an absolutely remarkable situation in 1968. And then you hold your convention in Chicago, where Richard Daley, the mayor of Chicago, is the old school Tammany Hall style patronage boss. And so the police, which are obviously under the control of Daley, are facing these student protests on the streets in Chicago. There's violence between the cops and the student protesters. So it's basically Democrat on Democrat violence in the outside the convention hall, and there's a lot of Democrat on Democrat violence inside the convention hall.
As the mayor said that year, the police are not there to create disorder. They're there to preserve disorder.
That's right. And they do that in 1968 outside the convention. And Daley's on the floor of the convention, and there are famous speeches by members of the convention basically criticizing Daley for Gestapo tactics on the streets of Chicago. And so you just have this open revolt inside the Democratic convention. And then at the end of it, a guy who didn't run in any of the primaries, a guy who got, I think, 1% of all of the primary voters, Hubert Humphrey, is chosen as the nominee by all of the insiders inside the convention hall. So it's the classic smoke-filled room situation. And this, in 1968, is regarded as no longer possible. TV has opened up the proceedings. So the idea that the people shouldn't be in charge of this process, I think, that's where you meet that resistance in 68. And the last point on this is that the 68 convention gives rise to the McGovern-Fraser Commission, which creates the modern presidential primary system that we have today. So if you're looking for the roots of how we nominate presidential candidates today, it's in that convention in 68.
I want to end just briefly by talking about 2020, which was not exactly memorable nor consequential, but it was unique in that the in-person portion of the convention essentially did not happen for either side, little bits and pieces, but mostly virtual. Things happened. Candidates were nominated, and we have these conventions here in 2024. But I asked at the end of our last conversation, is there a future without political conventions? What did we see kind of in 2020 that maybe lends us to believe that there's a future that looks something like that?
Right. In 2020, essentially, you didn't really have conventions. You didn't really need them either because your candidates were already nominated, and those candidates could speak directly to the American people, whether they were in a convention hall or whether they were somewhere else. And so the idea that you all need to get together at this convention so that the American people can hear from the candidate is just something that technology, communication has really rendered somewhat obsolete.
Dr. Joseph Postell, Associate Professor of Politics here at Hillsdale College, as we walk through the most important and consequential political conventions in our country's history. Dr. Postell, thanks for joining us here on the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.
Great to be with you.
Up next, Trent England, founder and executive director of Save Our States. He'll tell us about a conflict emerging between two ideas to change elections, popular on the left. I'm Scot Bertram. This is the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.
Hey there! Today I want to tell you about the Hillsdale K-12 Classical Education Podcast. This unique show explains how children benefit from an American classical education. Whether you're a teacher, student, or parent, you'll find something of value on the show. You'll hear from teachers and administrators from schools around the country, as well as Hillsdale professors and friends who are leading the effort to revive the American tradition of K-12 education. When you listen, you'll learn all about classical education, what it is, how to teach it, and why it matters today. And there are dozens of back episodes on specific topics, like teaching Singapore math, reading great books, and even understanding how athletics is critical to a child's development. Listen every Monday on podcast.hillsdale.edu. That's podcast.hillsdale.edu or wherever you find your audio.
Welcome back to the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour. I'm Scot Bertram. Be sure to check out the Hillsdale College Podcast Network at podcast.hillsdale.edu or wherever you get your audio. We're joined by Trent England. He is Executive Director of Save Our States. More at saveourstates.com. You can also find him on X at Trent England. Trent, thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah, my pleasure, Scott. Thank you.
Discussing a piece you wrote earlier this year that perhaps will find a little more attention as Election Day approaches. Popular vote compact collides with ranked choice voting. Now, you and I have talked previously on this program about both those concepts. Before we dig into this piece, I think for those new listeners or listeners who need a refresher, perhaps we have to define those terms to make sure people know what we're talking about. So let's start with ranked choice voting, because this is now being used in a couple of states specifically for presidential electors this year, and also in other areas for elections. How does ranked choice voting work, and how popular is it becoming around the country?
Yeah, we'll really find out how popular this is later this year, because there are ballot measures to enact ranked choice voting in states like Idaho and Oregon and sort of in Montana. There's a ballot measure to repeal it in Alaska. There's one to ban it in Missouri. So there are going to be a lot of voters, particularly in the West, who find themselves making choices about whether they want ranked choice voting in their states or not. But it's a system that makes elections quite a bit more complicated, because it asks voters not to just vote for a candidate, but to rank the candidates that are on the ballot in each race. And so, you might have 5 people running for Congress. And so instead of picking one and voting for that candidate, you are allowed at least to rank all of the candidates on the ballot, right? So your first choice, your second choice, your third, fourth, fifth choice for that office. And then when the votes are counted up, they count the first place votes. And if no one has a majority of first place votes, which, oftentimes in a 5-way race is going to be the case, then they take the least popular candidate, the one with the least first place votes, eliminate that candidate, and then anyone who gave that candidate a first place vote, if they voted someone else in their second place spot, then that gets sort of shifted up, counted as a first place vote, and they recount all of the votes again. Mm-hmm. And then they do this again and again, and potentially again and again, until they have created a majority winner through that system. This is one of the claims that they make. It guarantees a majority winner, but it does that by counting, second, third, fourth preference votes. And it also means that if you don't rank all of the candidates and your rankings get exhausted, they say, you run out of rankings on your ballot is just set aside, and it's as if you didn't vote in that election at all. So, this system takes voters a lot more time. It takes election officials a lot more time and computer technology in order to run this tabulating system to come up with the ranked choice voting winner.
There are many questions, concerns, problems with ranked choice voting. I invite you to check back in our archives here for a previous conversation with Trent about ranked choice voting. Now we have to talk about something that's a little more straightforward, the National Popular Vote Compact or the National Popular Vote Campaign. What is this all about, and how close are advocates to actually enacting it now?
Yeah, national popular vote is something that came actually from Al Gore's loss way back in 2000. Folks who wanted to get rid of the Electoral College but recognized that amending the Constitution is really hard, decided that if they could convince enough states to change how they select their presidential electors, so state legislatures have this power under Article 2 of the Constitution, and if they could get enough state legislatures to say, we're going to choose our presidential electors not based on the votes of people in our state, but instead based on the votes of people in every state, the national popular vote, then we could force the Electoral College to rubber stamp the national popular vote result and basically sort of nullify the Electoral College effect, even while leaving the Electoral College process in place. And they have successfully gotten 17 states, and there's kind of the states that you might expect. They're the blue states, most of the states on the coasts, for example, to pass this interstate compact. Those states control 209 electoral votes, but the compact only takes effect if they get enough states into it that they control 270 or more electoral votes, right? The magic majority that controls who becomes president. So they have a little ways to go, but they're about 80% of the way there, and that's really what I created Save Our States originally to work against, was this national popular vote effort that really threatens to deal one more, I think, body blow to our constitutional system of federalism.
Talking with Trent England from Save Our States, more at saveourstates.com. Many places where ranked choice voting is in place are also places where there's a push for the National Popular Vote Compact. And your piece at Real Clear Politics talks about the potential collision, the potential conflict between the Popular Vote Compact and ranked choice voting. Again, National Popular Vote Compact is not in place right now. If it were, though, what would be potentially the problem with using totals from states using ranked choice voting?
Yeah, this is a really interesting conflict between, what I obviously think are sort of two bad ideas that get even worse when you mix them together. The problem with ranked choice voting and national popular vote is that ranked choice voting is done at the state level. And to use ranked choice voting, you have to centralize all of the election data. So this is in the law in states like Maine and Alaska that use ranked choice voting at the state level. All of that ballot data has to be consolidated before you run it through the ranked choice voting process. You can't do this at the precinct level because you have to know which candidate received the total, the total number of first place votes, right? In order to run that process that I described, where you find the least popular candidate, you eliminate that candidate, you shift up those votes, right? To do that, everything has to be centralized. You have to have every ballot, every vote, it all has to be in one place at one time. And that's because, you might, if you did it at the precinct level, somebody might be less popular over here and they get eliminated, but over in that precinct over there, somebody else is less popular and they get eliminated, right? And this turns out to matter a lot. It can actually change the results of an election when people make mistakes in this. And this happened actually in a school board election in California. They made a mistake in tabulating the ballot data. They eliminated the wrong candidate first, and it changed who won the election. Basically changed one of the losers into the winner, and the winner became the loser, and took them 4 months to figure all of this out. With national popular vote, right? If you are running that process in Maine, you're running that process in Alaska, you're not. It's basically not a math problem, right? Right. And this gets really extreme when you consider that sometimes in our elections, we have independent candidates or third-party candidates, somebody like a Ross Perot, who actually get a lot of votes, Usually it's a lot of votes, maybe more from certain states than others, right? So Ross Perot, back in 1992, he actually came in second place in a couple of states. If one of those states had been using ranked choice voting, then the major party candidate who came in third, once you run it through the ranked choice voting process and you eliminate the candidate because that candidate is less popular than the top two, then you eliminate all those votes, you zero them out. I mean, that's the most kind of radical example of why ranked choice voting can't be used and combined into the national popular vote. And it's just a good example of why this National Popular Vote Compact that tries to combine different kinds of election results from different states really hasn't been very well thought through.
Yeah, in a way, the conflict is almost too obvious because the National Popular Vote Compact simply says every vote counts, every vote matters. And in ranked choice voting, you're then saying, well, not every vote actually will count. Quite literally, if you get down to a fourth or a fifth or a sixth level of trying to eliminate candidates and pack in votes. And in the end, we don't really have an accurate representation of who gets what vote because everything's been manipulated. They're two things that are very much at odds.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And it's just, as I say, I think both of these systems, right, have their problems. And when you put them together, it magnifies, both kinds of problems, right? National popular vote does not really consider and just chooses to ignore the fact that there are different ways of doing elections in different states. Most of them are, sort of minor. They have different recount rules, for example, or different ways, that voters are allowed to early vote, right? But some of these differences are significant enough that you couldn't, a state could not allow one county to have 40 days of early voting and say that another county can only have one weekend of early voting, right? That would not be allowable under the equal protection guarantee in the Constitution within a state. But, different states can have different rules. And as long as the elections are contained within each state, it's not a problem. And this is the system that the founders designed. But when you take something like ranked choice voting that's so radically different, and as you say, what a vote means in a ranked choice voting system is basically impossible to tell until you actually go to tally up the votes at the end of the process, right? Voters don't even really know what their vote is going to mean when they cast a vote in a ranked choice voting election. Yeah, when you try to combine that data across state lines, it ceases to have any mathematical meaning, which means it ceases to have any democratic meaning. But the folks pushing these systems, that they don't want to acknowledge these very basic problems because it becomes a problem for their larger political agenda.
Trent England with us from SaveOurStates.com. One final question. I don't want to put you in the prediction business. It looks possible that, again, in 2024, we'll have a result in the presidential election in which there is one popular vote winner, whatever that means, right? And then an electoral college winner, a real winner of the election. If that does happen, the National Popular Vote Compact is, as you told us earlier, nearing that number where the trigger mechanism would put it in effect for those states who have agreed to it. Are you worried if we reach that result in November that this run-up to 2028 will be all about a massive push toward a National Popular Vote Compact?
I am concerned about that. We've already seen some of the lobbyists for National Popular Vote sort of promising people that this is going to be the last election where the Electoral College works as the founders designed, that they're going to put this into place by 2028. And as you say, there is this possibility that we could have another election where the winner is not the candidate who received the most popular votes. And it becomes a real challenge because most Americans have never really been educated about why our system works the way it does and why it's so important to have these checks and balances in our Constitution, like the Electoral College. It's a real educational challenge, I think, for all of us to help people understand that it's so much better to have a system that checks the power of the biggest states, the biggest cities, spreads that power out across the country, creating this balance of power where people in small states and rural areas, small towns still have a say in our national politics. But no, I think it's going to be a real push. And frankly, I've talked to state legislators, even who are Democrats, right? They're frustrated with the outcome of some of these elections, but they understand in some cases why the Electoral College matters, but just feel like they're sort of overwhelmed by the kind of far left progressive activists who are pushing this agenda. So they're going to need a lot of support if we have another election result like this, because it used to be bipartisan. A lot of Democrats supported the Electoral College. JFK, Kennedy, as a young senator in the 1950s, was probably the most eloquent defender of his generation of the Electoral College. But we're obviously living in a different America these days and have our work cut out for us.
Trent England is Executive Director of Save Our States. Find them at saveourstates.com. You can find Trent on X at Trent England. The speech earlier this year at Real Clear Politics, popular vote compact collides with ranked choice voting. Trent, thank you so much for joining us here on the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.
My pleasure, Scott. Thank you.
Up next, Dr. Kevin Gerstle from Hillsdale's Mathematics Department will tell us all about cryptography. I'm Scot Bertram. This is the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour. Hey, it's Scot Bertram, and I've got a challenge for you today. Become a better educated American citizen. And to help you do just that, we at Hillsdale College have our free online courses available for all who wish to learn. Our challenge? Take just one of our courses. There are so many to choose from. You can discover the beauty of the Bible and the Genesis story, study the writings of C.S. Lewis, or explore the true meaning of America in Constitution 101. We have dozens more to choose from, and all these self-paced free courses feature Hillsdale faculty and scholars, many you've heard on this podcast. So visit hillsdale.edu/course, COURSE, and pick one of the more than 30 free Hillsdale courses. I hope you'll accept my challenge. Pick whichever course you like and become a more educated citizen today. Go to hillsdale.edu/course, COURSE. That's hillsdale.edu/course. Welcome back to the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour. I'm Scot Bertram. You can check out radiohour.hillsdale.edu. Click on affiliates to find a radio station near you airing this program. We're joined by Dr. Kevin Gerstle. He is Associate Professor of Mathematics here at Hillsdale College. Dr. Gerstle, thanks for joining us.
Oh, thank you for having me, Scott.
Saw on the class schedule that you're teaching a course in cryptography in the fall and thought that would be of interest to our listeners. So we spend some time today on the history and evolution of cryptography. First, we define the term. That's helpful for our listeners. What is cryptography?
It's always a good starting point, knowing what you're talking about. So cryptography can be used to refer to a lot of different things, especially in the field of cybersecurity. But I would ultimately describe it as the study of two different opposing processes, just encryption and decryption of messages or various forms of data. Where encryption refers to taking some information that makes sense, that's easily viewable, and converting it via code into some format that looks like gibberish, that can't be read. Mm-hmm. And decryption is doing essentially the same thing in reverse, taking some unreadable message and converting it back to something that makes sense. And kind of the process of encryption and decryption gathered together ultimately form what's called cryptography, taking messages, securely transmitting them, having them be readable at the other end, but not privy to anyone who intercepts it somewhere in the middle.
How would you describe how cryptography has evolved over time, ancient methods, early methods, to modern encryption algorithms, which people deal with probably more often than they even know?
Oh, absolutely. So cryptography as a field has been around for a very long time, since about 2000 BC, the time of the Egyptians, believe it or not. The early kind of forms of encryption and decryption algorithms tended to be pretty simple. Stuff like, hey, every time you want to use the letter A, replace it with a B. Anytime you have a letter B, replace it with a C, and just do the same thing in reverse. Which, if you don't know what you're doing, can be a good way of taking a message and turning it into something encrypted. Mm-hmm. Nowadays, modern computer can decrypt that in less time than it takes you to blink. Modern time, I would say encryption methods have become much more sophisticated and are effectively impossible to crack by hand nowadays, especially with the advent of computers over the last 70, 80 years has led to much more sophisticated methods being used. Another kind of way that it's evolved over time is up until the early mid-1900s, cryptography was pretty much just the role of the government and the military. And nowadays, it's used in all sorts of contexts. Like you said, people use it every day without knowing about it. Every time they hop on the internet, do some sort of banking transaction, send an email, there's cryptography involved, whether you know it or not.
Yep. Are there any pivotal moments, historical events that help to shape the development of cryptography?
I would say over the course of history, war is what's been the driving force behind the development of a lot of cryptography, from the time of the Spartans in 600 BC to more modern times. World War II, Cold War era has kind of been has led to pivotal points in cryptography, especially World War II with the German Enigma machine, which was a Nazi machine used to encrypt messages via some sort of crazy-looking rotary device. You see them in museums nowadays. It was the work of many different engineers, particularly, or most famously, I should say, Alan Turing, with his bomb machine at Bletchley Park in the UK, who cracked the code. And that kind of led to more of a modern or more widespread recognition of cryptography and helped to shorten the course of World War II by several years.
Talking with Dr. Kevin Gerstle about the history and evolution of cryptography in our conversation today. We allude to this. We use it far more than we might know. Everyday technology, communication over the internet, financial transactions, authentication in ways. How is cryptography used, and how does it function so quickly? I mean, it is immediate and it is secure in many places.
Absolutely. Anytime you go onto the internet, or you're putting out all sorts of data that can be used to track you, to read any communications you sent, your password, your bank accounts, your location, anything that you think of that can be thought of as being encoded in some digital format, that's being put out there when you do anything electronic, essentially. And cryptography is oftentimes going on behind the scenes, taking messages, every time you click the button to say, I want to transfer $200 from this account to another, you're going through a bunch of different private servers. The banks are doing everything they can to scramble all your information so that other people can't use it. And using things like virtual private networks or VPNs. There's lots of different sort of ideas that are going on that are being used to, as much as possible, reduce your vulnerability to hacker, phisher, you name it, types of attacks.
Those hackers and fishermen, perhaps? The people who are trying...
fishermen of data, sure, right, why not?
Yes. People who are trying to get at this sensitive information. How do they do it? The one I've heard of brute force, which is just as clunky as it sounds, generally, right? You try over and over again until perhaps you get it right. How are these people trying to get at this information?
Oh, they have all sorts of ways to try and get at it. You mentioned brute force, which, as you said, is again and again trying. Nowadays, that mostly means setting up a series of computers to do that for you, which can try inputting random passwords and information about you, for instance, far quicker than you could just sitting there by hand trying to do it yourself. There's a lot of different types of attack methods, like, for instance, chosen plain text or ciphertext attacks, where you somehow get a hold of both the encrypted and decrypted information and use that to sort of reverse engineer what's the decryption method to help you predict, now that we know how we're decrypting messages, we can use that information in the future. Anytime you're doing something on the internet, you're leaking data about yourself, and that data, whether it's explicit in the form of like passwords if you happen to use something like your birthday. Pro tip, don't do that. Or any other sort of information that can be used to identify you is going to be used against you, and whether that's in the form of cryptography or something else. It can also be used to help you, though, through all of these good security measures that you should be taking.
Sure. So you mentioned passwords, and I want to just ask very quickly, how complicated does a password need to be? It certainly shouldn't be the word password.
That would be a bad start.
Or your birth date, as you mentioned. But does it have to be a completely random series of numbers and digits and characters? How complicated should a password be?
Messy and complicated is not as important as length, I would say, in forming a password. I'm no IT expert. This is not my area of expertise, but all of my training has taught me that the best way to form a password is to take some short phrase, something that can't be easily identifiable to you, but like something that's like a few words that's 20 or so letters long. That's going to be that's going to be the best sort of password that's both secure and easy for you to remember and hard for someone else to access using brute force methods.
Sure. All right. Talking to Dr. Kevin Gerstle about cryptography here on the show. Have there been real world examples of vulnerabilities being exploited that then have led to changes? How do companies, how do people involved in cryptography try to adjust to be one or two steps ahead of people trying to get at that information?
Well, it's certainly an ongoing battle that I don't think is ever really going to end, even with the potential advent of quantum computers around the corner, which are super fast and powerful computers. There's always going to be the battle of people who want to use your data against you and people who want to keep one step, hopefully more than that, ahead of the curve in protecting it. They could take the form of ransomware attacks, which are commonly used to kind of encrypt companies or users' private data, and then say, hey, you either pay me X amount of money or I'm going to delete your data or leave it in a form you'll never be able to read again, or worse, sell it to someone else. There's all sorts of other scams. Even at the college, I've gotten several messages over the years purportedly to be from someone like the chair of my department or the provost saying, hey, Kevin, how's it going? I need you to go out and get me $100 in gift cards and read me off that information. I'll pay you back, I promise. If you're getting those sorts of messages, those are scams. Those are someone who's found a vulnerability, a weakness in the security system, and has gotten in and using up those people's information. And while the IT department here has been great at helping patch those up, there's always going to be more bad actors finding more and more new ways to get into the system.
How do governments regulate the use of cryptography? Should we be aware or concerned about that? And implications, therefore, for individual privacy, individual security?
Yeah, the governments are at the forefront. They've always been at the forefront of the study of cryptography and both encryption and decryption methods. And while kind of the average person is able to do a lot more now than they could 100 years ago, I would still say that, for instance, here in the U.S., the NSA is the go-to government agency for looking at this sort of thing. So NSA is in charge of or knows about many different top secret encryption methods. They classify them. Also decryption methods, the details you're not going to be able to find out if you're just Joe Schmo off the street, if you're not working for them. In fact, the NSA is the world's largest employer of mathematicians for that very purpose, finding new ways to get ahead of the game as much as possible.
Dr. Kevin Gerstle from our mathematics department here at Hillsdale. He is Associate Professor of Mathematics as we chat a bit about cryptography. Dr. Gerstle, thanks so much for joining us here on the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.
Thank you, Scott. It's been a pleasure.
That will wrap up this edition of the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour. Our thanks to Dr. Joe Postell from Hillsdale's Politics Department, Trent England from Save Our States, and Dr. Kevin Gerstle from Hillsdale's Mathematics Department. The Radio Free Hillsdale Hour is recorded at the studios of WRFH, the student-run radio station at Hillsdale College. Remember, you can hear new episodes every week on this station. You also can find extended versions of some of our interviews or listen anytime to the podcast. Find it at podcast.hillsdale.edu or wherever you get your audio. Until next week, I'm Scot Bertram, and this has been the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.